Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. 2 weeks ago I uploaded a video celebrating the greatness that is Streets of Rage 2 and proclaimed it, from my perspective, as the greatest Sega game ever made. My main point of the argument for this was that, apart from the game selling extremely well, it was a great beat 'em up, with no game existing on the Super Nintendo that could compete with it. A luxury that the likes of Sonic didn't have, because you had a Super Mario on the other side of the court. This video would result in many people telling me that I was wrong, and that the Super Nintendo does have a better beat 'em up than Streets of Rage 2, and that game is Turtles in Time. So, with this in mind, in this upload we are going to explore whether there is any truth to such a statement, and go back and look at the history of the game and deeply analyse the gameplay to once and for all find out how great Turtles in Time really is. Only then can we contrast Turtles and Streets of Rage 2 side by side to really find out which one is the greatest of the 16-bit war. Is there any truth at all to Turtles being superior to the Mega Drive's greatest classic? Or is this just a case of Nintendo fanboyism raising its ugly head? Let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. A game, some say, is better than Streets of Rage 2. Yeah! The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, known as the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles in my region in the 80s and 90s, was a cultural phenomenon, and was the fidget spinners of its day in terms of popularity with the kids. Toys and merchandise were literally bloody everywhere for this bloody thing, and the franchise seemed to be the most popular kids show on television since the likes of Transformers and Ghostbusters. Like with any popular franchise of the period, this would then in turn bring along games. The first Turtles video game, released in 1989, was an action-adventure platforming game involving overhead areas which the player explores in order to enter the main side-scrolling portions of the game. The first TMNT video game, like with many games based on famous non-gaming licenses, would receive mixed reviews due to its generally unpolished nature. Whilst the first game was available for the NES and a variety of different microcomputers of the day, the game's sequel would debut in the arcades. The second Turtles game took a very different approach to the original, and instead existed as an innovative side-scrolling beat 'em up. This is definitely a game worth looking at in detail down the line, but today let's keep fixated on Turtles in Time, which we'll get to shortly. Anyway, this second Turtles game, simply known as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the arcades, would be ported to the NES and various micros under the name of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. The ports of this game are nowhere near as fondly remembered as Turtles in Time, simply due to the hardwares the game was ported to simply being too weak to imitate the arcade experience very well. Now, this is where Turtles game history gets a tad confusing. The world would get multiple Game Boy games, a DOS game, a pinball game, and even a colouring game for the home micros. The next blockbuster game though would arrive in the arcades in 1991. This would be the fantastic Konami beat 'em up and the most loved Turtles game of all time, Konami's Turtles in Time. Despite this being only the second Turtles arcade game, and the third mainline Turtles game overall, amusingly it would be named Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 when it arrived on the Super Nintendo in the next year of 1992. The reason was, this was because in between the arcade release and the SNES port of Turtles in Time, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, the Manhattan Project, would arrive on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and would appear to utilise the same game engine as Turtles 2 for the platform. So obviously Turtles in Time would not arrive home until after the release of this game. So now we have chronologically examined how we have got here. Before we look at the Super Nintendo version of the Turtles in Time, let's focus on what made the arcade version of this title so great. The game features a short introductory cutscene detailing the game's plot. The Turtles are watching a TV newscast that is being reported on by April O'Neil. Krang flies in using a giant exosuit and steals the Statue of Liberty before Shredder hijacks the airwaves to laugh at the Turtles. This extremely simple scene establishes a basic story for the game ahead. Just like the first Turtles arcade game, Turtles in Time was released in the arcades with two distinct style cabinets. One that allowed 2 players at a time to play this side-scrolling beat-em-up, and another cabinet that let up to 4 players jump in on the action. In this same time frame, Konami would also release 4-player X-Men and Simpsons beat-em-ups, which are just as well liked as this Turtles game. Titles which I can only assume were designed to run in the same engine, bearing in mind how similar these 3 games mechanically are. In the 2-player version of this game, on the player select screen the player gets to choose which one of the 4 turtles they wish to control. However, in the 4-player version of this title, each of the 4 characters are assigned to an individual control panel each. Leonardo, Donatello, Michelangelo and Raphael are all playable. Whilst the 4 turtles themselves all look very similar, like the TV show, each of them have different weapons, and in this game they each have their own unique strengths and weaknesses. During the combat in the game, characters have the ability to execute more powerful attacks by hitting an enemy multiple times in a row. They also have the capacity to pick up and throw enemies into surrounding groups. In terms of controlling the turtles, the control scheme is basically the same as the previous arcade game and other Konami beat-em-ups that we touched on earlier. The cabinets feature extremely simplistic button layouts. Joysticks are present for movement, but each player only has access to a simple 2-button layout, one for jumping and one for attacking. 2-button layouts are nothing new to the genre, and the very successful Final Fight that released just a few years earlier gave players the same number of buttons to utilise too. I feel Turtles in Time and the other Konami beat-em-ups though probably give the player a wider range of attacks and movement, as the turtles can run, perform a slide or dash attack, jump higher, perform a stationary or direct air attack, as well as have the ability to perform special attacks. Sure, it isn't the most intuitive, innovative control scheme, but it gets the job done, and helps deliver the pick up and play experience you would expect from games heavily targeted towards children. Turtles, X-Men and The Simpsons were all franchises primarily aimed at that age range. The opening stage of a Turtles game takes place in New York City, on the most stereotypical stage you could possibly expect from a 1991 beat-em-up. Stylistically, the stage looks very similar to stages found within both Final Fight and the first 2 Streets of Rage games. I guess the inspiration in the genre generated by the 1987 movie Streets of Fire just simply wasn't dying down, leading to some very samey level design across the entire field. On this first stage, waves of enemies come in the form of foot soldiers. Touching back on the combat again, I think it's a nice innovative touch that the player can throw their opponents towards the screen, creating an illusion of fighting on more than just a 2-dimensional plane. This is nice because, apart from the delivery of an extra layer of depth, the mechanic is cartoony and ridiculous, so absolutely perfect for a game based on a children's cartoon. Energy bars can also be refilled in the game by picking up pizzas, another nice feature that echoes back to the property the game is based on. Apart from the enemies, additional threats come in the form of the wrecking balls placed throughout the stage, meaning players have to think slightly more about where they position their characters than within many other beat-em-ups. Throughout the stage there are also exploding barrels, and Krang in the exosuit makes an appearance to shoot lasers from the suit's eyes, creating further obstacles for the character to dodge away from, rather than just regular enemy attacks. Every stage in the game contains the classic beat-em-up trope of facing off against a boss at the end of each one. The first stage, simply known as the Big Apple, finds the turtles facing off with Baxter, an enemy that varies from others on the stage in that he must be combated and defeated in midair. Stage 2, known as Alley Cat Blues, takes place in an area featuring lots of run-down, graffiti-covered buildings in which enemies exit from for you to take on. Once again, we have seen this exact style stage before, in both Final Fight and Streets of Rage, so nothing new to the genre in terms of scenery. This Turtles in Time stage probably has more detail in it though, There are leaky fire hydrants present, rubbish-filled skips, and enemies jumping onto the screen from stairwells above. In fact, enemies are attacking from all sorts of angles, including from jumping behind fences. There are also varied palette swaps of the foot soldiers to take down in this one, and completely new enemies to the game in the form of boxing glove wielding robots. The boss battle takes place against Metalhead, a robot version of the Turtles. The boss ups the level of challenge in comparison to the previous one by using a mix of both ground and aerial based manoeuvres. The next stage takes place in the sewers, a location obviously synonymous with the Turtles franchise. The first Turtles arcade game features a stage where combat takes place whilst riding a skateboard. This same mechanic is taken and re-implemented into the sewer stage here, switching the skateboard out for a surfboard. The presence of the surfboards mean that this level is auto-scrolling and the player must fight opponents and dodge obstacles as they quickly appear on the screen. Pace and movement on this stage is quicker than previous levels. After another boss battle that isn't too challenging, a cutscene occurs where a signal from Shredder appears, banishing the Turtles 25 million years back in time, meaning the Turtles get to time travel, hence the name Turtles in Time. Stage 4, that feels like a stage we would find when playing Cadillacs and Dinosaurs, takes place in a forest and foot soldiers descend from above being carried by pterodactyls. These airborne dinos also drop projectiles from above, triggering memories of the annoying birds in Mega Man. As you progress through the stage, you also encounter rock soldiers, who are a bit more sturdy than the regular foot soldiers. The stage backdrop and foreground transitions quickly from an area filled with vegetation to a volcanic molten lava-ridden area. The boss fight takes place against one of the game's tougher opponents, in which the key to victory can be achieved by managing to get behind it. After achieving victory, the Turtles are transported through time once again to 1530 AD, through to a stage known as Skull and Crossbones, which takes place aboard a pirate ship. This short stage is full of recurring established enemies, and is followed up with a boss fight against Toka and Razor. This is the first time in the game the player is forced to face off against two boss characters at once. The characters are then transported to 1885, to a stage that takes place on the back of a moving goods train. The level is designed the same as the boat stages in Streets of Rage, and the train stage in Final Fight, in that the background scrolls at a brisk pace, whilst the ground below the player moves in order to create the illusion of a moving vehicle. The stage has some enemies entering the fray on horseback, which conjures memories of Sunset Riders, a game that was released the same year as this one. After getting through the boss of this stage, we travel in time once again to the futuristic year of 2020. The stage starts out like the sewer surfing stage, only the surfboards have been switched out for hoverboards, because as you will be aware, flying hoverboards have existed for several years now. Films set at a way earlier date than 2020 feature them after all. The boss battle of this stage finally culminates in an encounter with Krang in an exosuit. Once defeating him, the character is transported to the even more futuristic year of 2100. A year I can guarantee still won't feature hoverboards in real life, nor will we have built a space civilization either, like what this title suggests. We'll be lucky to even get games with shorter load times by this period. I am not sure why story writers always choose such close years in these games, but the year 100,000 would make this a little more believable, I think. As expected, in this Death Star-like stage, you fight your way through a range of opponents, including lots of foot soldiers and multiple robot-like enemies who debut on this stage. In the final throes of the game, you must face off against Krang once more, this time without the exosuit. Then the player is walked back in time to the tubular year of 1991 to face off in a final encounter with Shredder. In regards to this part of the game, I thought it was a nice touch to place the Statue of Liberty in the background, as it brings the narrative of the game full circle. Just before the game's credits, a final cutscene occurs showing a news report of our heroes returning the lost statue, once again to make America great again. Yeah! The original arcade version of this game is an impressive one, featuring great music, bright cartoony graphics and art that jumps out of the screen, and a simple yet effective control layout that anyone could learn and master. In terms of non-gaming franchises, Konami knocked it out of the park. with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Turtles in Time in the arcades. In regards to this, following the game's arcade release, Turtles in Time became Konami's best-selling arcade title. Critics would find that, although this title was largely similar to the previous Turtles arcade game, they felt that it was a net improvement over its predecessor on all points, including graphics, music, and gameplay. Overall, the game was hailed for staying true to its source material, which certainly cannot be said for many games based on TV shows. Konami did a top-notch job here. So that was the original game, but what about the home conversion on the SNES? Did the Super Nintendo bring the arcade experience home? Let us explore this further. Straight away, when looking at the first stage of the game, the number of enemies on the screen appearing at once in this title have been significantly reduced from that of the game's arcade counterpart. The sizes of all sprites in the game are also smaller, less detailed, and feature less animation frames than in the arcade version, in a move that is similar to when you compare the arcade and Super Nintendo versions of Street Fighter 2. The game is still good, but nowhere as impressive as the title found in cabinets. The game has also been reduced from a 4-player title down to cater to a maximum of just 2 players. In fact, the more I look at this game alongside its arcade counterpart, the more I notice it has been scaled back, and none of the backgrounds feature the same level of detail neither. Positive changes though is that I noticed Stage 3 in the sewers has a different boss, which is a nice touch as the previous boss was just a large number of reoccurring enemies who featured earlier in the stage, so good to see a positive change rather than scaling back in some way. Stage 4 though brings the most impressive addition yet, an entire new bloody stage, in the form of a Technodrome. This is a mechanical themed stage featuring lots of robotic enemies and foot soldiers. Surprisingly, the middle of the stage presents a mid-boss fight against Toka and Razor, a boss encounter that does not appear until much later in the game in the arcade version. The next portion of the stage features the players ascending a lift taking on enemies, a trope found in a number of beat-em-ups that was missing from the arcade version of this title. The end of the stage includes a really interesting battle where you must take out enemies while Shredder shoots projectiles at you from an overhead perspective. The developer put a lot of effort into this additional stage. The boss at the end of the prehistoric stage has also been changed, but personally I prefer the one from before. The bosses from the Skull and Crossbones stage appeared as mid-level bosses in the new Technodrome stage, so the pirate-themed level now features a fight with Rocksteady and Bebop dressed as pirates. A surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. The Western Train stage features no significant changes, but moving on, the player gets to indulge in a brand new stage, which utilises the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 abilities to create a very F-Zero looking environment. This stage ends with a confrontation with Krang, just like on the alternative stage found in the game's arcade counterpart, which is also set in 2020. Starbase is once again the final stage for the game, where you face off against Krang at the end, then finally against Shredder. Although, to be fair, the Shredder fight is slightly different, as at this time Shredder transforms into, Kevin Nash. So that was the SNES port of the game. The Super Nintendo was not capable of providing the same level of detail and finesse in the Turtles in Time game than what could be found in the arcades. The game features less detail, less animations, less enemies on screen at once, and the 4-player feature is reduced down to just 2. However, in many ways Konami made up for the port's shortcomings by including new stages and boss encounters whilst cutting as little content as possible from the game. Overall, I guess the game is a very strong port, considering the hardware limitations of the Super Nintendo. In terms of the game's reception at the time, the SNES version was praised for its additional stages and gameplay modes by critics. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a unanimous score of 9 out of 10, applauding the fun gameplay, the new moves, the accurate recreation of the arcade version's graphics, and the 2-player versus mode, though they criticised that the game is a bit too easy. All Game lauded the conversion for its visuals, which replicate the cartoon's art style. The game's music and sound effects were also praised. Nintendojo called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4 Turtles in Time the best Ninja Turtles game of all time. Entertainment Weekly wrote that the Turtles may have peaked on the big screen, but in video game land, they're just reaching their potential. So now that I have given you all a breakdown on both the versions of this game, I hope you can appreciate just how good Turtles in Time is. The game is fantastic, not just as a Turtles game, not just as a beat 'em up game, but a bloody great game in general. A bit like Streets of Rage 2 on the Mega Drive. So, taking into account how good both of these titles are, I feel I have backed myself into a corner somewhat when it comes to deciding which of these two classic all-time greats are better, as criticising either of these games at this point just feels plain and simply wrong. So, which is better? Is it Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo, which I covered today, or Streets of Rage 2, which we looked at 2 weeks ago? I think the fairest way for me to decide is to break this quick assessment into categories: music, graphics and stage design, controls and gameplay. A 2 out of 3 falls encounter to come to a decision with which of these I prefer. Let's start out with the game's music. The original version of the game's soundtrack was composed by Mitsuhiko Izumi, a TMNT veteran who also composed the music for the previous arcade game in the series. It was arranged for the Super NES version by Kazuhiko Uehara and Harumi Ueko, both of whom went on to produce several Konami games, including the following Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, Tournament Fighters. All the music in this game sounds great and sets the tone of each stage well, so no complaints at all really. The problem for Turtles though is that Streets of Rage 2 did even more than that. The music within Streets of Rage 2 was produced by Yuzo Koshiro, one of the most notable video game composers of all time. The soundtrack for Streets of Rage 2 is considered revolutionary and ahead of its time for its blend of swaggering house synths, dirty electro-funk and trancey electronic textures that would feel as comfortable in a nightclub as a video game. In fact, back in 1992, Electronic Games described Yuzo Koshiro as just about universally acknowledged as the most gifted composer currently working in the video game field. Reception for the soundtrack was so high that the game's music composer, Yuzo Koshiro, was invited to nightclubs to DJ the tracks. Turtles in Time's soundtrack has never had the same level as appeal that Streets of Rage 2 holds, so that is 1-0 to Streets of Rage. The next category we are going to focus on is both the game's graphics and stage design. Streets of Rage 2 is a pleasure to the eyes. Graphics are bright and colourful, and the attention to detail on every single playable character and enemy sprite is quite astounding. It is an all-around beautiful game, and Sega had come a long way very quickly in comparison to the graphics found in both the first game and Golden Axe, the Mega Drive's earlier beat-em-up titles. As good as the graphics are in the game, I do find most of the stage design in the title very unimaginative. If you have played the first Streets of Rage game, and even Final Fight prior to that, there is not that many new things to see. It is very samey in that regard. The game looks polished as hell, but tried little to innovate in that regard. When heavily analysing Turtles next to all of these other beat-em-ups, I groaned in the opening stages as I was beginning to notice all of these overused Streets of Fire tropes that were infecting Turtles as well. But you quickly realise it only does so for the first couple of stages, and as you travel through time, you leave the boring, overused, crime-ridden generic New York archetypes that occur in beat-em-up so much, and instead find yourself in prehistoric landscapes, space, and the Wild West, and all sorts. The stage variety is lovely. Another thing I love about Turtles over Streets of Rage in terms of the stages and the graphics is just how cartoony and close to the source material the game looks, and the amount of obstacles that occur on various stages really mixes things up from simply dealing with waves of enemies after waves of enemies, making it more varied than Streets of Rage in that regard too. Meaning I am going to draw the two games at a 1-all at this stage. Now it's time to move on to my final step of this analysis, the controls. The controls in Turtles in Time really complement the gameplay and are absolutely perfect for a game that must have been targeted towards attracting a child audience. As good as the controls are, they do little in the way of new things. The old one jump and one attack button layout by this point in time was old news and had been used in countless amounts of beat-em-ups before. In Turtles in Time you are fairly limited in the variety of attacks you can perform. Combat though can be really mixed up sometimes, and the game offers a lot of variety in that some of the stages include riding surf and hoverboards, offering a more varied gameplay experience in some ways than that of which is found in Streets of Rage 2. Now, Streets of Rage 2 does not offer players the opportunity to ride cool surfboards, but the button layout in the game offers players a vast amount of different options whilst in combat. In fact, the team who created Streets of Rage 2 did not simply copy and paste the combat for their game found in other beat-em-ups like Turtles did, but instead looked at the success of Street Fighter 2 and looked at how they could implement mechanics similar to that into their game. Streets of Rage 2 was a game that had the most graceful flow to its controls that the world of beat-em-ups had ever seen. The Streets of Rage game builds on established mechanisms within the genre further by implementing many tactical manoeuvres into the mix. Changes do not simply end here though, as team attacks are executable too. This includes the ability to hold an enemy in place whilst your teammate pummels them, and the ability to vault over others on the playing field. Characters also each have their own unique blitz attack, which allow players to deal colossal amounts of damage with a single hit. They can also execute what is known as a breakout move, which are used to break holds which allow players to damage enemies from both in front and behind them. All in all, combat just features a lot more variety in the Streets of Rage series than that of which is found in any of the early 90s Konami side-scrolling beat-em-ups. For me, the controls in Streets of Rage 2 is the primary reason that the game is untouchable in comparison to others when we talk about the games of this type. So my final thoughts for the video. From my personal analysis, I'm going to conclude that no, Turtles in Time is not as good as Streets of Rage 2, as there are so many elements in that game that put Streets of Rage a cut above. Despite all of this, Turtles in Time is a bloody good game, which features one of the best visual art styles in the entirety of the Super Nintendo's library, and some of the most varied looking stages and unique bosses in the entire beat-em-up genre. Turtles in Time really is a brilliant game, and it almost feels criminal to compare two of the greatest of all time side by side so closely. But the question with regards to which one was better of the two was an intriguing one for me, and certainly one I felt was worth exploring, as you can probably tell from the length of this analysis I have made. I am sure this video is going to cause tons of controversy and varied opinion down in my comment section below, but I would love to hear your thoughts on which of these games you believe is the best. Maybe you think I am right and agree with my summary, or maybe you think I am completely wrong and am simply throwing fuel on the fire to relight the 16-bit console wars. I am really keen to hear your thoughts. Let the sorting commence. Yeah! If you enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell as I upload multiple videos like this a week discussing various elements of retro gaming history. Which two games do you think I should compare next? Finally, my channel is partially funded by the generous donations I receive via Patreon. Patrons can earn a credit and a shout at the end of these videos. These people make working full-time on YouTube just that little bit less scary, so I'd like to thank you all very much for that. So huge shout-outs go to Carl Johnson, Sebastian Venners, JD Robinson, Spaces, Andrew Bazansky, Asobi Kwang DX, Michael Baker, Tom Elliott, Computer Man, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Daniel Daly, RetroVersion.com, House of the Ted, Dan Barlow Jr., Joel, and all of my other patrons. Yeah!